When a country changes a big law, it's more than just putting a new rule on the books. It's a promise to fix something that was broken. Today, we're investigating one of those promises, the one that came with cannabis legalization in Canada, and the really complicated story the data has to tell. Let's get into it. Okay, so picture this. It's 2018. Canada does something huge. It becomes only the second country in the entire world to legalize recreational cannabis. And this was a big deal, not just for business or personal freedoms, but because it was supposed to be about social justice.
At its very heart, legalization was sold as an act of fairness. The goal was to stop the real damage caused by decades of prohibition, a system that we know burdened some communities way more than others. We're talking about criminal records that could just ruin a person's life, affecting everything from getting a job to finding a place to live.
And that is the question that hangs over this entire policy. Now, years later, did legalization actually deliver on that promise of fairness for everyone? Or did the old problems just find new ways to stick around? On paper, the arguments for legalization were pretty straightforward. It was meant to pull money and power away from organized crime. It was also supposed to get rid of the heavy costs of prohibition. Everything from the cost of policing it to the lifelong burden of a criminal record for a pretty minor offense. So, did it work? Did the scales of justice finally balance out? To figure that out, we're not just going to guess. We're going to follow the evidence, almost like detectives on a case. Our case file, if you will, comes from a huge 2024 study that looked at survey data from over 25,000 Canadians. The mission was to see who, even after legalization, was still getting caught up in the justice system for cannabis. So, let's see what the clues revealed. All right, so our investigation has to start with the most obvious question. We know prohibition hit racialized communities disproportionately hard. So did legalization actually change any of that? You'd think that would be a pretty simple yes or no question, right? The researchers looked at the arrest and conviction rates that Canadians from different racial backgrounds reported themselves. But what they found, well, it was anything but simple. And the very first clue is a bombshell. 3.9 times. Look, this isn't some small statistical blip. It's a massive disparity that just jumps right out of the data. Let me show you what this actually looks like. So this chart just lays it all out. Using white individuals as the baseline, that's the one on the chart, the study found that Black individuals were nearly 4 times more likely to report a conviction, and Indigenous individuals over 3 times more likely. And here's the crucial part. The researchers confirmed this wasn't because these groups use more cannabis. The data says they don't. So if it's not about usage, what on earth is going on? Okay, so the next logical step in our investigation is to look at other factors. Could this all be about things like poverty and education, which we know are often tied to race? Let's follow the data. And the data here is pretty clear. There's a really strong link between your socioeconomic status and whether you get a cannabis conviction. People with lower incomes and less education were way more likely to face legal consequences. So it seems like we have our answer. But the story definitely does not end there. And here's the twist in the case. Even after the researchers controlled for income and education, those big racial disparities, they didn't just disappear. So while money and school definitely play a role, they don't explain the whole picture. There was another factor at play, another layer we have to peel back. This is when the researchers realized that justice isn't just about who you are or how much money you make. It's also about where you live. So they decided to look at the impact of a person's neighborhood. So they used this tool called the Neighborhood Material Deprivation Index. I know, it's a mouthful, but it's basically a way of scoring a neighborhood's overall economic health. A neighborhood with high unemployment and lower average incomes would be considered materially deprived. Think of how they did their analysis like peeling an onion. First, they started with that raw data on race. Then, they peeled back a layer and added in individual income and education to see how the numbers shifted. And for the final step, they layered in the data about the kind of neighborhood people lived in. And that neighborhood layer was a game changer. This quote from the study says it all. Just living in a more privileged area cut your odds of conviction in half compared to living in the most deprived area, and that was regardless of your own personal situation. So this brings us to the final reveal. What happened when they put it all together? Okay, so look closely here. This first chart shows the odds after adjusting for a person's income and education, but before adding in the neighborhood data. The odds of conviction are still nearly 5 times higher for Black individuals and 2 times higher for Indigenous individuals.
Now, watch what happens when we add that final layer.
And here it is. This is the climax of our whole data story. For Indigenous individuals, once you factor in neighborhood deprivation, that disparity is mostly explained. It's no longer statistically significant. But for Black individuals, the story is completely different. Even after accounting for personal income, education, and neighborhood, they still face over 4 times the odds of conviction. That disparity remains stubbornly high and unexplained by all the other factors.
So what do we learn from our investigation? We've learned that the roots of this inequality are just incredibly deep, and changing one law isn't nearly enough to pull them all out.
The study's authors really put it perfectly. The problem isn't a single point of bias, like one police officer's decision. It's systemic. It's woven into where people can live, the jobs they can get, and how much they can earn. It's a whole cycle.
But the researchers don't just leave us with the problem. They point towards solutions, ways to actually fulfill that original promise of legalization. This includes things like actively clearing old criminal records, making sure the communities most harmed by prohibition can actually participate in the legal industry, and reinvesting profits back into those same neighborhoods.
And that is the ultimate takeaway here. The story of cannabis justice in Canada really shows that one single policy change, no matter how well-intentioned it is, just can't instantly fix a system that was shaped by decades and decades of inequity. This data forces us to ask a much bigger question. If legalization was just the first step on a very long road, what does it really take to repair all that harm from prohibition? That's the crucial question the data leaves us with.